Renaissance. We'll talk about the effects that have on the intellectual movements of especially Northern Europe, particularly on religious and political factors. We're also going to see this expanded period of European exploration and then eventually conquest, the conquistador period, changing economic realities throughout the world, particularly with Europe, North America, South America, and Africa, but also too with the Far East. So there's a lot to talk about here in this section. Well, the Italian Renaissance doesn't kind of happen on the dark side of the moon. It doesn't take place on an island where the only place on earth is Italy. And we're going to see that as humanism is interested in humanistic ideology, plays out, it begins to export itself beyond the bounds of just northern Italian city-states and begins to reach, among other places, Northern Europe. And these humanists here in Northern Europe, they shared this interest in classical texts with the Italians of the Renaissance. However, what you're going to see is this predomination of the ideas of Christianity are going to play a much greater role in the humanistic movement of the North. Now, because of this preoccupation, humanists are going to be looking for ancient classical kind of sources of Christianity rather than just sort of Greco-Roman philosophical texts or civic texts and things like that. This is going to include Augustine of Hippo, Jerome, but especially the Bible. It's hard for us to imagine today the Bible is sort of this squirreled away, forgotten text. But for a lot of people, the Bible had been suppressed and was something of an unknown quantity, or at least a hardly referenced kind of quantity. The conclusion that a lot of these people are going to reach is an interesting one, and one that still pervades down to us today, is that first century Christianity is kind of best Christianity, and that in fact this simple kind of early days of Christianity had been sort of muddled by the medieval kind of ritualism, right? The Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic of the Church, had exacerbated some of this ideological antagonism with some other problems of causing people to be very uncertain of the idea of salvation, which of course predominated a lot of 14 and 1500 thinkers when they talked about Christianity, through some corrupt practices, right? The sale of offices, simony, corruption, nepotism, sale of indulgences, the idea of purgatory in a way to kind of expiate yourself from the sins of purgatory and things like that. And so what these humanists do is they stress the ideas of reason, education, self-improvement. So again, they're not terribly different in a lot of regards to the Italian humanists. So here we have our Northern European humanist. This is Erasmus, and he's hard at work on his classical texts. Well, the main fire starter kind of figure is going to be this little German beer-drinking priest named Martin Luther, right? He's actually pretty typical of what you would see with pious Christians here in the 1500s. He viewed the ritual, or he came to view the rituals of the Roman Catholic Church as problematical, since they did not, by themselves, guarantee his own personal salvation. This, again, like I said, was something that a lot of people here at this point had really started to think a lot about. If you look back into previous centuries' records, it wasn't something that people were really worried about, the idea of, how do I know I'm a Christian and I'm saved, and so. But this was something that preoccupied a lot of their thought. You have some non-theological, or at least tangentially theological issues of corruptions of the church, right? This was the idea that the church is getting involved in political matters, money matters, rather than spiritual matters. And so this most egregious kind of example that really rubbed guys like Martin Luther the wrong way was the practice of the sale of indulgences. And it was pretty obvious what it was going for, that there was a new roof they needed to buy for St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Somebody's got to finance this, so hey, pay money so that you or your relatives or any of these other guys don't have to spend any more time in purgatory expiating themselves of any sins they may have committed, even though they're saved and they're going to go to heaven eventually. So this was the proposition that was put forward to a lot of people. Guys like Martin Luther really sort of chafed against that. Where in the Bible do we have, purgatory, all this kind of stuff? And so he was a theologian. He was also a person who was extremely neurotic often about his own personal salvation. And so when he joins the church, they send him to theology school basically to shut him up and so he can answer his own questions. He examines a lot of these church teachings, and of course he spends a lot of time, he now has direct access to the Bible itself. The church at that point had taught the idea of necessity of good works. For those of you who want to read up on Christianity, you can find this in James. Luther comes much more around to the Pauline conclusion that humans can never be good enough for God, that humans are imperfect, and that faith alone, a gift of God, grace is what guarantees salvation. So these are these ideas. This is a scene from a Luther movie that they made a few years ago. There he is nailing his 95 Theses to the Württemberg church door. So this takes place on October 31st of 1517. He publishes these 95 Theses, which were essentially arguments against what the church was doing at that point. They weren't indictments per se. They were more like challenges for church officials to debate him on these practices. So they're essentially sort of debate prompts, would not be a bad way to look at it. Now, of course, it took his own position, and he wanted the church to come in, debate him, and refute these, right? But what happens here is something that's not necessarily theological in nature is going to take over, and that is the press gets a hold of this. The printing press had been in operation for over half a century at this point, and they begin passing out Luther's 95 Theses as if they were indictments of the church. The reason that this catches on is not necessarily just due to people's sudden interest in, hey, we better study these indictments against the church. These are weighty theological matters. I've read a lot of theology, and I kind of agree with Luther, or I disagree with Luther. It wasn't like that. What happens is it ignites a lot of anti-papal sentiment inside Germany. The Germans were beginning to develop what you and I might refer to as a sort of proto-nationalist kind of feeling. We're Germans. Who are the popes? The popes are mostly Italians. Germans, Italians. We're not going to send them our money. That kind of idea. Right? Well, eventually Luther does get these debates, and he's a really great debater. He was a college professor, among other talents that he had, and he debates all these great points where the Bible doesn't provide for this, the Bible doesn't provide for that, and so one of the ways that these church officials manage to try to trap him is, hey, you've been criticizing the church kind of left and right. Maybe you have some points that we agree with, maybe you don't. But if you're just going to use this line of reasoning all the time, then the Pope isn't in the Bible. And Luther's forced to agree. Yeah, I don't think the Pope has a lot of authority. I don't think that's in there. I'm condensing a lot of the argument here for you, but basically to come out and say that the Pope is non-biblical is a heresy of the church, and he gets excommunicated. He gets kicked out of the Catholic Church. Luther is then sent before the political leader of this day, the Holy Roman Emperor, right, who is ultra-Catholic. Not only is his Catholic ties political for his management of the Holy Roman Empire in Germany and northern Italy, but also personally, he's really super-duper Catholic. And so he views Luther as a heretic, and he's going to condemn him, and he's going to get rid of him. But Luther has some friends amongst the northern and western German princes who basically, they sort of kidnap him, right? They engineer his waylaying on the road, they grab him, and they haul him off to a castle for a year. And so the reason that these guys are behind this is, I'm sure at least a little bit part of it is theological. I mean, they write the their own confession on the matter, but also they are seeking to gain a great deal of autonomy politically away from the Holy Roman Emperor. So this is an opportunity to kind of push back against these guys. So Luther, once he gets excommunicated, his books on the matter start getting burned. And there's an old saying that when you start burning books, it won't be long before you start burning people, and that is what will happen. Well, Luther gets the political support of a lot of these loyal princes in northern Germany. How much of it is theological, how much of it is political, we don't know, because of course at that point in history the two were essentially the same anyway, right? Well, Luther realizes that he's no longer going to be able to reform the church from within because they kind of want to barbecue it. It's sort of tough to reform anything when you're dead. So he's got to win converts over to his style of reformation. So essentially he's got a sort of separate church, but one that Luther, even in his own lifetime, never really regarded as a separate Christian movement. One of the acts he's going to do is he's going to translate the Bible into German so that the people can read the Bible for themselves. He's going to use it in his services. He also utilizes the homily and song. He's going to reform the Mass of this. He's going to have Bible readings. If you go to a Lutheran church today, they'll still may sing all 17 verses of "Mighty Fortress is Our God," that kind of thing. So as the movement began to take off, he sends out some of his emissaries then to convert these areas. Now he's going to meet with the most success in urban spaces. This is also then going to become an international movement as Protestantism spreads to Denmark, Scandinavia, and then also big chunks of the Baltic region, right? Luther, on the social front, emphasizes the idea of family. He denounces the idea of clerical celibacy. He says that's not in the Bible. There's no reason that priests have to be celibate. He himself married. I think that he and his wife, Katie von Bora, have like 6 kids or something like that. So I think they also had like a microbrew in their basement. So it gives you an idea of kind of what Luther's working on, right? Well, the Habsburgs, the Holy Roman Emperor dynasty, right, had tried to go after Luther as heretic. Luther as a heretic, and then his followers as heretics. But the problem is they get bogged down with a lot of other things. They fight a war against the French. They get invaded by the Turks. So the Habsburgs are, as a matter of course, going to have to allow Luther's Protestant movement to stand because they lack the strength to go after it. This is one of the sieges of Vienna that's going to take place here with the Turks surrounding Vienna and laying siege to it. Until eventually one of these relief forces comes in and drives these guys away. But even though Vienna survives, the Habsburgs are kind of too busy to do anything else, right? So Luther is going to be the first guy to challenge Roman Catholic authority on theological grounds and not get killed. There had been a number of movements theologically to try to challenge Catholic Church hegemony, and for the most part, they ended up like Jan Hus did. They're barbecued as a result of that. So Luther is the first. He's not the first one to do it. He's the first one to succeed at doing it and not die. Which means then a lot of other people within the Catholic Church that had agreed with him and said, I kind of think this guy's right. Many of them then, they feel emboldened to join him. You'll see that Ulrich Zwingli is going to convert Switzerland over to Protestantism, but in doing so, there's going to be a lot of violence that, as he tries to enforce kind of his version of the way that the New Testament ought to be applied to everyday life, there are going to be people that push back against this. You'll see a number of Anabaptist movements, which is they come to the view that, well, if they've been baptized wrongly by Catholic priests, then they have to get rebaptized Anabaptists. They're going to form a very specific theological block. They appeal to the poor, they will stress simplicity, and they're going to spawn a number of pacifist movements. Most recognizable kind of to us today might be the Mennonites, right? Later in Switzerland, and then also in parts of France, John Calvin is going to preach this idea of predetermination, where God already knows who his elect are going to be. How do you show that you're one of the elect, according to Calvin? You've got to have faith, you're going to have a godly life, you participate in the sacraments. Calvinism, though, becomes a very activist religion because the Calvinists believe that they're predetermined. They're doing God's work, so they're going to go out and they're going to do this. And Calvinists were really, really aggressive in proselytization. So here are some of these Anabaptists living in southern Germany in the 16th century. So how does this play out politically? Because as we've seen, the Catholic Church is a major political player. And so to have somebody to be able to stand and not, fry as a theological challenge to the Catholic Church is going to open up a lot of other, not only theological challenges, but political challenges as well. Into this comes the second Tudor king, Henry VIII. Henry VIII had wanted to get a divorce from his wife because he wasn't able to produce a male heir with her, so he blamed her. He has, 6 wives or something like that. And the Catholic Church refused to give him an annulment because divorce was strictly, again, you can't just, leave your wife and legally get remarried. So he finally eventually says, okay, Catholic Church, forget it. We're not going to deal with you anymore. And he has himself proclaimed the only supreme head of the Church of England. Now, Henry, as the supreme head of the Church of England, he actually doesn't make much reform. He's not this, ardent reformer like Luther or Calvin or Zwingli or any of these guys. And in fact, the Church of England that breaks away from the Roman Catholic Church is, in a lot of ways, is Protestant kind of name only, right? Henry's son, he tolerated Protestants of all kinds, and what that meant was a lot of people who were Protestant on the continent of Europe, if they were persecuted, they would then migrate to England. And what that meant, though, was you're going to have a pretty polyglot population of non-Catholic Christians inside of England that by the time you get to the 17th century, it's going to be kind of wild and out of control. Mary, Queen of Scots, when she inherits the throne, she's going to attempt to make England Catholic again. But England had abandoned the Pope, and after over 20 years of Protestantism, they really, really were afraid of a Catholic dynasty because she had married a Spanish king. So there was a real resistance politically to returning to the Pope's fold. Henry's daughter that takes over after her is Elizabeth, right? And she reconciles with the English Catholics, people that wanted to stay Catholic, but moved England pretty much in a fairly clearly Protestant direction. However, people who wanted some real fundamental reform had begun to push for greater change, and they're going to have to wait till a little bit later to see that. So there's Henry VIII, kind of porky by our standards. But it's nice, to be the king, and you can eat whatever you want. And of course, ladies, this was the moment when you could still be a sexy guy wearing skirt, pantyhose, and pumps. These are his 6 wives. A bunch of them wound up dead, but anyway, enough on that. This is Queen Elizabeth in all of her splendor. I know her head looks kind of like a starburst, right? Or maybe her neck is shooting it out of that coat. It's really, I don't know if that was a good idea, actually, in retrospect. She's also got a giant pet rat, looks like. Maybe that's an ermine or something. But that's what you got going on with her. Well, so we've looked at this sort of theological challenge from kind of outside the Catholic Church. Now, let's look at it from the inside of this. Catholicism actually felt a great deal of threat from this, what they refer to as a Protestant heresy. Their view was there's just one church, and then everybody else, they're going to hell. So it doesn't make them happy to see all these people sort of starting their own denominations of Christianity. However, the popes had admittedly, been bogged down really by a lot of corrupt practices during the Renaissance. And so the Council of Trent, they come together, they start talking about a lot of Luther's issues. And it turns out a lot of people who decided to remain in the Catholic Church, many of them, Luther has a point about this, or Calvin has a point about this. But they don't want to split the church up. And so this reorganization that takes place afterwards isn't going to have a whole lot of new doctrine that comes out of it, but a real rededication to, let's stick to more spiritual matters than engaging in warfare and loaning money to these guys and having political alliances that take place. You'll see that this creates a great deal of excitement within the Catholic Church. And so, for example, the Society of Jesus, or the Jesuits, as we would call them, is an order of monks that's forming here in the 1500s. And they directly follow the Pope. Their oath of fealty is to the Pope, and they worked as teachers. You'll still see a lot of Jesuit schools, high schools around today, but also as missionaries. They're going to go out, in many cases, they're going to reconvert places that had gone over to Calvinism, such as the Poles, back to Roman Catholicism. Now, the church decided not to compromise with these various Protestant movements and ordered an increase in these Inquisition activities throughout Catholic Europe to try to get a hold of these heretics. So it wasn't all smiles and ice cream for these guys. So here you can see the Jesuits. They're on the deck of some ship, and they're taking themselves overseas, and they're going to work on converting different people to Catholic Christianity, right? When we talk about Europe through some of these time periods, Asia couldn't have been sort of further away in terms of its economic and social success. Well, Europe wallows kind of in darkness immediately following the Roman fall of the Western Roman Empire, and you have a limited number of intellectual advances. The Near Eastern societies, the Umayyads of the Muslim empires, they're going through a great intellectual spurt. They're having a lot of medical and cartographical and scientific and mathematical advantages, okay? But also to the Chinese societies in East Asia are flourishing as well. What happens is the Crusades creates an interesting interlude, right, in the 11th and the 12th centuries, whereas the western terminus of the Silk Road that ended on the eastern shores of the Mediterranean now all of a sudden is now in European hands again, where these Christians have a hold of this, particularly European Christians, and now they're able to make trade contacts with China. Admittedly, it's over a ridiculously long overland journey, but these Italian merchants now can have access to these, and they can start bringing them back to Europe. Also at this point, we're going to have Genghis Khan, right? These Mongolian conquests out of Central Asia, where these people are overpopulating what is essentially flat kind of prairie land with limited natural resources, and so they go on a conquering kind of binge. It also doesn't hurt the fact that you've got Genghis Khan as your commander, right? All these conquests that go first east and then south and then west and then east again back into China are going to open the door here in the 1200s to travelers from Europe to China in order to investigate what's going on in the Far East. The reason for this is the Mongol dynasty, the Yuan dynasty, that the Mongols are going to found in China, they're extremely distrustful of Chinese. There's this narrow little veneer of Mongolians in charge of China, and they're very afraid of a Chinese revolution from below. And so they're bringing in, Muslim advisors from the Middle East. If you've got to bring in some of these white Christian guys from Europe, they're willing to do it. Now, the most famous of these guys is Marco Polo. There's a lot of debate about, what credit Marco Polo deserves, but popularly he's remembered for this book about this 25-year journey here into China, and it sets off a great deal of interest in Europe to try to open up more relations with China because of the way he describes these guys. Now, of course, he's living in the palace with Kublai Khan, golden roofs, jade everywhere, spices, so he makes it sound great. All of China isn't like that, but now all of a sudden there's this economic desire to try to get back in touch with China because after the Crusades are over and the Christians are ejected again, for the most part, they've lost that trade corridor, and if they can reestablish it, you'll have this. This is one of the prints here that Europeans are going to have, that canal cities, not unlike Venice, exist in China with a great deal of wealth and trade. This is these overland journeys to get to China, and then some of the trips back from this. There's Marco Polo at the feet of Kublai Khan in the imperial court, and you can see how well dressed everybody is, on the wealth, and the gold, and the jade, and the jewels, and spices, and all this kind of stuff. Also, walking around in the silk robe all day, it's got to be awesome. I don't know, I've never tried it. So, like I said, when the Ottoman Turks completely recapture and close off the Middle East, this means that that valve is now shut. The success of the Italian merchants in the Mediterranean trading rings is going to spur a lot of these Atlantic maritime nations to try to duplicate this success, but they're not going to be able to go through the Mediterranean. They're going to have to find some other way to go around, particularly Africa. So you're going to have this massive exploration craze that is going to be caused by several factors all coming together at the same time. One is, of course, most obviously money from trade. People are motivated by the ability to make a lot of money. And of course, if you can bring some of this stuff back from the Far East, spices, jade, jewelry, etc., right? Then you're going to make a lot of money because you're going to be the only one selling a very exotic item to people in Europe. But of course, that means that you've got to have the money in Europe to spend on exotic items. New national monarchies are really starting to form, and they see that money and also land and sea lane control is a great way to expand their power. They're very interested in expanding their power not only in Europe, but also around the world. You have a general settling of society during relatively peaceful periods of the 15th and the 16th century. Not massive plagues, not massive wars. And you're also going to see, coupled with this, is some improved nautical technology. There's going to be some navigation, there's going to be some shipbuilding, but there's also going to be some military improvements in terms of nautical technology. And a lot of people argue that the military improvements, such as the cannons on these caravels and these galleons, are what are going to really make the difference, because nobody in either the South Atlantic or the Indian Ocean or the Western Pacific has anything that can compete on the water with these European vessels at this point. All right. One of our main characters in this is a Portuguese guy named Prince Henry, and he sets up this navigation school here in Portugal in order to explore the West African coastline. Soon after, we're going to see that fleets and fleets of these Portuguese ships begin trying to figure out exactly how big is Africa. The problem is, of course, that the wind mostly either blows from the south or is not blowing a whole lot around the equator, and that means that going south along the African coast is really slow going. Also, if you go inland in Africa, if you're a white European, there's a good chance you're just going to drop dead. Right? Yellow fever and malaria killed these people left and right, so much so that Africa for a long time was known as the white man's grave. So you have some real problems dealing with this. This brings a lot of these trading fleets in contact with these West African kingdoms. What do we have from Europe that we can trade for you guys in order to make these sailing bases that we're going to need to take on water and food and get sailing supplies like rope and sails and stuff like that? We can trade some stuff to you, and of course, one of the things that the African kingdoms have to offer is gold and slaves, that they are already engaged in these economic activities in West Africa. Eventually, they're going to make their way around the Horn, right around Cape of Good Hope in South Africa and into the Indian Ocean. Once they're in the Indian Ocean, though, by force of weapons, the Portuguese are going to have an extremely dominant position. They're going to have ports all along southern and eastern Asia, and they're going to be driving out a lot of the Muslim and local trading fleets, and they're going to dominate this valuable spice trade leading from Japan, China, India, and Africa all the way back to Portugal. European leaders are going to see this massive profit that's going to be coming in, and Portugal is reaping a massive amount of wealth as a result of this. This is one of these posters that you would see up in the port facilities if you're a sailor, talking about how you can go overseas and make a lot of money. Well, that's great. The problem with this is that it takes over a year to go one way to China in that direction and then back. And even and by 1492, we're going to see that Spain hadn't even completely locked down this route yet. All right, to get to Asia. What if there was a way to get there quicker? Well, an Italian immigrant into Spain, a sailor named Christopher Columbus, Cristobal Colombo, I think. He convinces the Queen of Spain and a number of shipping cartels to give him some money because his calculation of the Earth's circumference is wrong, right? See, most people have the idea that Columbus convinced people in Spain to allow him to sail west, to give him the money to sail west, because he was saying, no, the Earth's not flat like a table, and you're not going to sail off, right? It's round. No serious person believed the Earth was flat by a table in 1492, okay? The question was, how big is the ball? Okay? How big is the globe? See, most people had been able to calculate using trigonometry exactly what the circumference of the Earth was. In fact, there are a lot of people who had calculated it out and were, for the most part, pretty close to what it is now. Which means that if you're looking west from Spain, you've got the Atlantic Ocean that you can see, and then this whole expanse of what you and I would call the Americas and the Pacific Ocean is one giant ocean. And it's too big to cross. In 1492, hey Columbus, you can't carry enough fresh water, you can't carry enough food, you're going to die just out in the middle of the ocean sailing westward. That was the actual problem. Columbus's math was wrong, and he said that the Earth is about 25% smaller than what it actually is. It turns out that he would put Southeast Asia somewhere in the neighborhood of what you and I would call the Caribbean today, all right? Well, he eventually concludes these people, look, it's not going to be that much money. If I fail, you're not out that much cash, but if I succeed, we'll have now the en route to get to China. So, the Spanish are going to fund his mission, and he goes across the ocean, and actually he's pretty inspiring when he's at sea. These 3 ships reach the New World after a rather courageous voyage, and they're going to touch down somewhere in the Caribbean in October of 1492. Now, what he finds is some dark-skinned Aborigines, right? And by his calculations, he's off the coast of India somewhere. So naturally, he names them El Indios. He's near India, so he names them the Indians. And the name has kind of stuck. And we still struggle today what to call red-skinned North American Aboriginal persons because that's actually a stupid name. So anyway, one of the things he's looking for is gold, spices, things that he can take back and sell, right? Or just gold, you can mint that into currency. And you don't find that. You don't find that in the Caribbean because it doesn't exist there. But after a series of voyages, he's going to set up a number of colonies that are under Spanish control. They're interested in maintaining control over the region because strategically it's a great outpost. There are some things that they eventually will start bringing into Spain that will be of great value, such as tobacco. And so they're going to be using the local people for agricultural labor, but also they're very interested in getting Catholic Christianity onto these people because they see the world in terms of there's Catholic Christianity and then there's everybody else that's going to hell. So there you go. Now, Columbus, even after several voyages, seems to be that he was convinced that he had found Asia, that it just kind of looked different. More and more people were kind of like, this doesn't look like Asia. This seems like something completely different. A number of subsequent voyages, in fact, discovered that this is a new territory that nobody in Europe knew about, North and South America. It's named after Amerigo Vespucci, who sails off, and he's the one that really kind of publishes the accounts to know. These are 2 different continents that exist here. And this is why it's named America, after him, Amerigo Vespucci. It could be worse, though. We could live in Vespuccia now. So, let that sink in, right? Ferdinand Magellan, at least his crew, they even managed to circumnavigate the globe by going south of South America. So the red line gives you a basic idea of kind of how Columbus gets across the Atlantic, explores the Caribbean a little bit, and then eventually is going to come home. The Nina, the Pinta, the Santa Maria. I think there was supposed to be like a 4th ship that was supposed to go along. It had some technical problems or something like that. But the 3 of them are the ones that are going to land, and of course you can see from this is not a photograph, but it gives you a good idea of probably what's going on. They're setting up the cross, they've got their weapons, but they're trying to engage in trade with the Taino Indians that Columbus runs into, right? Well, even after Columbus goes back to Spain, and it turns out that he's not as good on land as he was at sea. He runs into all these political problems trying to manage a number of colonies. Waves, though, of conquerors are eventually going to start spreading out through much of Central and South America, taking over more and more of these territories. The most impressive conquest is the collapse here of the Aztec Empire in central Mexico, right? Hernando Cortez is going to go in and he's going to take over the Aztec Empire. And while the Caribbean doesn't have a lot of gold or silver, it turns out that the mainland does. The Aztecs have huge vaults full of gold, a giant city complex. They've got this enormous, sprawling political empire that they're in charge of, and Cortez winds up on top of it. You're also going to see another large empire, the Inca Empire, in South America that's going to be captured by Pizarro. You'll see Balboa capturing Panama. A number of these places are taken over. You'll see the Yucatan is going to fall to Spanish forces. And so both of these conquests, the Inca and the Aztec particularly, are going to net the Spanish crown hordes of gold and silver. And this is a great stimulant to get wave after wave of what becomes known as the conquistadores, right? The conquistador phenomenon. Our word in English, conquest, is a cognate of conquistador, right? So who were these guys? Well, a lot like Cortez, a lot like Pizarro, they're generally middle-class officers. These guys that probably weren't going to advance to the rank of, general or something like that because they didn't have noble connections with the monarchy. But if you go to the New World and through your own genius or ruthlessness or a combination of both, you can conquer all these places in the name of the Spanish monarchy. The motto is often best expressed as gold, glory, and God. You want the money, you want the fame from having taken these places over, but you also want to press Catholic Christianity onto these poor, unsaved heathens. Right now, how much of how much of each part, if you want to express it as a percentage, was an actual motivating factor, I'll leave that to an individual case-by-case basis. But generally speaking, all three of them are present for most of these guys. Now, a lot of these guys, they succeed. The ones that don't become, corpses in some swamp in the Americas, they do become self-made men. But for the most part, like Columbus, they run afoul of these old world political practices. And since they're not in the good graces of the noble classes, Spanish political systems, which is mostly still a very medieval-looking system, they wind up suppressing these guys. So this is Cortez. He goes from being a colonel or something like that in the Spanish army to emperor over 28 million Aztecs. Not bad. Hoard of gold and silver. He's an incredibly important person as a result of that. And so here you can see the conquistadores. They're out in the middle of nowhere. They've got their weapons. They've got their cross. They're going to be conquering and taking these places over. Well, regardless of the individual personalities, we have a massive sea change in terms of world commerce and contact with each other because Columbus's discovery opened up a valuable new trade here for Europe, Africa, and the Americas, and to a lesser extent, Asia. One of the things that you'll see is new agricultural products, especially from the New World, things like potatoes and tomatoes, as well as gold and silver, are going to be heading back to Europe. Colonists, whether you're talking about willing colonists from Europe or unwilling colonists from Africa, are going to be making their way in the other direction. Technology, animals that were for the most part unknown in the New World, beasts of burden like the horse. In South America they had like the alpaca, and animals like that they would occasionally use as a pack animal, but nothing like the horse. Also the cow, pigs are going to be coming across, but also to disease. The number one thing that is going to do in Native American Aboriginal societies is going to be these European and Old World diseases. Their bodies simply didn't have the ability to fight these off. Whether you're talking about the initial smallpox outbreak after 1492, or typhus, or a number of other diseases that were kind of bad for Europeans, are utterly devastating for Native American societies. We often lay a lot of the explanation for how is it that a relatively small group of outsiders can come and just conquer a couple of continents within the span of a few centuries. This is really unheard of. Disease was doing most of the work for these people. There have been estimates that somewhere between 90 and 98% of the American indigenous populations just are dying out from these European diseases before many of these people even get to them. All right. We're also going to see that there's going to be warfare and overwork that's going to take place. And as a result of that, the Spanish, particularly in the Caribbean, are looking for labor replacement. A lot of these people that are left are kind of worked to the point where they're no longer able to be worked anymore. They die out. The indigenous populations die out in the Caribbean, and so you're going to see that the Portuguese system of plantation slavery on their colonies in West Africa, which of course they had borrowed from West African kings, now is going to get imported across the ocean into the Caribbean. And that means that you've got a huge number of now African slaves making their way to the New World. And so this gives you a map of kind of what's going where. and how. This is the encomienda system. If you rebel against the Spanish, in this case it's the Spaniards are cutting off these Indians' hands so they can't rebel against them anymore. It's pretty rough stuff with this, right? Now, Spain goes from, in the 1400s, at the beginning of the 1400s, a fractious power. They're fighting a civil war kind of amongst themselves. You've got Christians versus other Christians, Christians versus Muslims, and then by 1521, by the sort of middle of the 1500s, all of a sudden Spain is the most powerful country on earth. It's got millions of subjects across the ocean. It's got gold and silver coming in huge numbers. All this agricultural product is piling up on the quays. This isn't fair, right? Not like the rest of the European countries are going to just send them a card at the end of the year. Hey, great job. It's cool that you're making all this money. No, they exist in a very competitive world. You're going to see that in this kerfuffle, politically, Portugal is rather miffed. Hey, we've done all this, kind of work. We would very much like to claim part of the New World. And it looked like Portugal and Spain is going to come to blows over this until finally the Pope intervenes and says, look, we don't need to be fighting each other. There's enough New World to go around. Portugal's going to be able to claim Brazil as a result of that, which is why if you go to South America today, most of the continent speaks Spanish, or at least a local variant of it. The Brazilians, on the other hand, speak Portuguese. Well, England and France are then going to be left to fight over kind of the leftovers, which is North America, right? The English are going to be using some bases, or at least some waters here in North America for its pirates to attack the Spanish gold ships on their way back to Spain, going through the Gulf Stream, right? Which is this the jet of water and air that goes between Florida and Cuba, then up the east coast of Florida and North America before heading back to the New World. Well, Spain understands that these English, pirates, many of them are acting at the behest of the English monarchy. Of course, the English monarchy can retort back and say, well, we told them not to do that. But Spain eventually, they create a political pretext for a declaration of war, and finally they are going to declare war on England in 1588, and they're going to attempt to invade. They load a huge army up on these giant Spanish galleons, and they go after the English here in a series of battles that take place in the English Channel that is often referred to as Battle of Spanish Armada. England has a much smaller navy. The ships are smaller, but they're also lighter and more maneuverable, and they have a different tactical style. The Spanish, typically, they sort of blast you with cannons and then try to get close and then board you and fight kind of, pirate style on the decks. The English, on the other hand, tended to try to sail away from you and blast you with long-range artillery. And this proves to be a much more effective method for operation. Also, too, the English are going to know the waters a lot better in terms of the wind and the tide. Parts of the Spanish fleet get destroyed in a storm. So anyway, all of this means that the Spanish invasion is turned back. Well, hooray, right? That means that England's not occupied by Spanish forces. That means that people in England don't have to start learning Spanish. Hooray, right? This also means that ever increasingly now the balance of naval power in the Atlantic starts tipping towards the British. This is the beginning of the end also for Spain's power here in Europe. So this is what you can see here with the Spanish Armada versus the English. And so from this point forward, we're going to see that ever increasingly northern European countries, Britain and France, are going to be dominating the colonial activities in the leftover territories of North America.